Welcome back to The Bible is Art, and in this video, I want to respond to this video the Gospel Coalition put up. It's a brief clip where Ligon Duncan and Matt, I don't know how to say his last name, is talking about liturgy. And I typically don't really have an interest in kind of like response type of content, only if we learn something interesting in the process, and we definitely do here. Now, this comes from a longer interview, which has many good things in it, and I would recommend it to you, but here it's not so much the good stuff we're gonna be responding to. So let's take a look.
Is it possible, though, Ligon, to overemphasize liturgy?
No question. Yeah, I mean, and you know, the Reformation is reacting against a sacralized liturgy where there's sort of a spiritual, mystical element to the way that the service is done. And there are a lot of evangelical friends of ours that have been attracted to Rome or to Eastern Orthodoxy or to something like an Anglo-Catholicism. And that's not what I'm commending at all. I think that's, in fact, I often find that people that are suffering from an experiential deficit themselves seek that experience to be filled in a liturgy. And liturgy is there to get out of the way so that we can commune with a living God.
Okay, so notice what he says. He says some people are attracted to these, let's say, higher forms of liturgical practice because they have some sort of experiential deficit. And he thinks it's not good for it to be filled through that. And then he says that the job of liturgy, the nature of liturgy, is to get out of the way. So notice the relationship between those two things. Why do you think it is that evangelicals would have an experiential deficit if you're saying liturgy, the goal of it is to get out of the way? Maybe there's a connection between those two things. Maybe if you're the kind of person who's designing and forming and thinking about a liturgy, and your main thought about it is this thing has to get away, and then your parishioners have a sense that it's kind of a little lacking or emptying of something, well, maybe it's because you designed it thinking that the main goal is to get out of the way, right? And what I've noticed as a broad pattern in some evangelical theology is that there's a difficulty with thinking about creation and how creation fits into God's world. Later, Matt will say that, drawing another analogy where he says, oh, liturgy is like the pipes that the water goes through. And both of these, I think, are very telling, right? Because the whole picture is that these are sort of things we have to have, but really, like, they got to get out of the way. It's just the pipes, right? But really, this is a broader pattern of thinking about creation. Apply this same logic to anything else in creation. What if you said a woman is just the vessel for bringing children into the world? You'd say, oh, no, there's something like profoundly wrong about your understanding of motherhood, right? And you could apply that to anything. What if you said, oh, creation is just there to get out of the way of redemption? You would say, no, that's like wildly off. Like, you have fundamentally misunderstood the relation of creation and God's kingdom, how these two things fit together. Now, of course, this goes back to just the sort of fundamental questions about Christ and culture, like in H. Richard Niebuhr's great work, Christ and Culture, where he presents different models for how Christians understand Christ and culture. And the fundamental Reformed position, of which Ligon Duncan is speaking, is that Christ redeems culture. He perfects creation. And so the liturgical acts as part of that creation is perfected and is brought up as the divine service. That's the first point. And notice another thing. He says that liturgy's job is to get out of the way. Well, get out of the way of what? And presumably he might say something like, well, the preaching of the word. To which you say, well, you use like these creational things, right? So you use your vocal cords. These are like creational things, right? And you're making decisions about whether it should be louder or softer? The dynamics of it. Should I go fast or slow? If there's different characters, do I use one voice or another voice when I'm, and presumably, like, you would have to take that chain of reasoning back and say, oh, well, I mean, we really want the word of God to speak for itself, which also you think about all the creational aspects of, like, oh, it's like written on a page, and like a printer printed this on like paper we made, which is a great example in and of itself about a better way to think about creation, where you think about the trees and the ink and about how this is all got brought into creating this book, and it's been taken up as these into the divine service, which is, I think, a better way to think about all of the liturgical acts, is that these things aren't hindrances, is that they're helps, and they've been taken up into the divine service, and they're used by God in these ways. And you start getting worried about the sort of theology here, because there are some, it's not Gnostic, but you start getting these little kind of Gnostic-y feelings, is that what God is really doing is he's working kind of outside or in spite of creation, right? And it's like we really gotta sort of push aside creation because it's getting in the way. We got to get it out so God can work, right? I've noticed a fascinating thing amongst evangelicals is that they have their own implicit liturgical thoughts, right? So one interesting thing is in most evangelical services, the congregation doesn't pray. And you might think, well, yeah, no, they do. Like, I hear the pastor and like the worship leaders pray. And I'm like, no, the people don't pray. And you say, oh no, yes, they do. They're praying in their hearts. Ah, very interesting. Because there are other liturgical acts that you would say, oh, you can't do that internally. So you would have no problem never seeing me actually intone a prayer. But if you saw me week after week not singing, you'd be like, there's something wrong. We'd be like, why? You'd be like, he's not singing. And even if I were to told you, to you being the sort of typical evangelical, be like, oh, well, he's singing in his heart. You'd go, I don't think that you can do that, right? And that's just because we have an implicit assumption about what liturgical acts can you do internally and what requires a creation. And I think a better way to think about it is to think holistically about creation and bring all of creation in, and creation is not a hindrance. So if you bring in, what do you think about the incarnation or in the Lord's Supper, right? How does creation fit in here, right? Creation to Jesus was not a hindrance, but creation was the very means of expression and bestowal of divine grace unto humanity. We would never say something like, oh, well, creation, Jesus's body, is just there to get out of the way of his divinity. We'd say, no, that's a wildly truncated understanding of how his body works. And this is the same idea. So when you say liturgy should get out of the way of what? This is the means by which God uses to commune with his people. The second point has to do with his first comment, how he frames it. He says, oh, it's this sacralized thing. Notice what he says.
The Reformation is reacting against a sacralized liturgy where there's sort of a spiritual, mystical element to the way that the service is done. And
so he says that the what he doesn't like is when the service is sacralized or there's a mystical sense. Now, when he says sacralized, that just means like sacred. And so when he says, oh, well, there's this sacralized thing, I honestly don't know what he means. And once again, I think this is kind of part of the problem, because if I were to steelman the case and say, Dr. Duncan, what do you mean by this sort of criticism you're making about it being too sacral or too mystical or something? What are some things he could possibly bring up? Well, let's just think through them. Maybe like incense? Well, incense was used as a liturgical element in the Old Testament. It's in Revelation, in the divine worship. It's used to symbolically represent the prayers of God's people, that God smells sweetly. And what I've noticed is there's a pattern of questioning that I find that evangelical theology and many pastors haven't really thought that deeply about. So I'll give you an example with this. Maybe he would say, yeah, incense is one of those things that shouldn't be used or is not great or whatever. And then you can just ask a series of questions like this. Okay, well, do you think that your service should smell bad? And he would say, well, no, of course not. Be like, well, should it smell good? And he'd be like, well, yeah, or maybe neutral. It'd be like, okay, well, let's say it smells good. There's a million different kinds of good. Should you make it smell one way or another, right? And he might say yes or no or something like this. And once you get to that line of questioning, then whatever he says about how the service should smell, you have to give a reason why. Why should it smell this way? If you say, oh, it should smell as neutral and as blank as possible, be like, okay, why? Right? What's your reason for having it completely neutral? Right? Because presumably, I don't think he's a Puritan, right? So I don't think he would say, let's say the architecture of the church or the windows or the lights, right? All of these things you have to make decisions about. And I don't think the decision he would make would say, I want everything as minimal and as neutral as possible. Because even neutrality communicates something, right? This is blank. It's not it's not very important, right? But it still communicates something. This is old, presuppositionalism or the Naked Public Square by what's his name, First Things editor originally, right? Where there is no neutral space. So a blank liturgical space will communicate something about man, something about God, right? And historically, Christians have said that, oh, this should be, they've said many things. One of the things is that they should say it should be beautiful. It should be expansive, because they thought this communicated certain things about God. And there's completely legitimate range of options about how to think about these things. But I find that in many evangelical theology, there's not great thinking about this, right? And so if you just keep asking those questions, what does this mean? If it smelled like something, if it looked like something, right? What should it and what should the basis of our reasoning depend upon? The other thing about this, about the mystical aspect, is that, well, I mean, maybe, and once again, I'm not exactly sure what this means, because if you take any service, whether it's any high liturgical service, everything that's done has a very specific theological meaning, right? It's not that it's trying to just invoke a sort of fake mystical thing, because even in, let's say, Dr. Duncan's service, you're going to have most of the things you do are very mystical, right? So you have prayer, where you are speaking to the God of the universe. You have the reading of Scripture, which is the reception of the words of the God of the universe. You have communion, which he believes is spiritually receiving the body and blood of Christ. Those are three wildly mystical things. And so it is fundamentally a mystical service. And with more traditional forms, what many of the forms are trying to do, it is trying to unfold in the actions, in the movements, in the smells, and what everything looks like, the interior nature of that service, right? So if this is a divine word, if this is speaking to God, oh, this should be elevated. One of the fundamental things that's fascinating that you see is politically, whenever you have a foreign dignitary come, or even, let's say, a pop star, all of your actions get very planned and organized, right? And they get symbolicized. Everything gets raised up. The order gets raised up. The rituals get raised up. Why? Is because you're doing all of these things to protect the honor and the nature and the glory of this thing that's going on. So we're going to think about everything. We're going to think about the smells, and we're going to think about the sounds. And I understand that there's a range of what Christians think you should and you shouldn't do, but to criticize something saying, oh, it's sacralized or mystical. And also his thing about the Reformation, it's being about arguing against about a sacralized service. Certainly there were liturgical reforms in the Reformation, but I don't know that I would say that the Reformation was fundamentally about desacralizing the service. Even you think Eucharistically, Luther and Calvin thought that this was real presence. So I don't know that you could make that argument. I think that the framing of this conversation doesn't really meet where a lot of people are today. When you talk to your just a normal evangelical person, they don't have a problem of overemphasizing the liturgy. They have the opposite problem, where all of these things, we want to think about and be purposeful about all these things, because in many ways, the standard evangelical service have lost much of Christian liturgical traditions. And I think that there's a lot of people who are asking these very fundamental basic questions of what is this service and how should the architecture be, and asking about all these elements. And what they see in other traditions is they say, oh, this thing is really well thought out. And there are certain Protestant criticisms of which me as a Protestant would hold, but nevertheless, there's a lot we can learn. Evangelicals do a really good job about thinking about intellectual architecture, right? Thinking about systematic theology. But what other traditions do well is creating not just the head, but the whole world. And at the end of the day, what people want is they want to live in a home. They don't just want to live in an intellectual palace. And they look at these other traditions and they say, wow, they've sort of thought through everything about how you move and how it should smell and how it should look. Interestingly, the same questions we do with our own homes, which reminds us of some of the prophetic things in the prophets about, oh, you are adorning your homes before you're adorning God's home. So I think it's less helpful framing it in terms of, oh, there's this bad mysticism and that stuff just has to get out of the way, as a sort of negative account, and instead think in a positive account and say, how can we think about this deeply and richly as Protestants? You can still retain your Protestant theology and still glean things, gather things from the theological Christian tradition, and it still be fundamentally Protestant. But I don't think it's helpful to frame it in ways to say it just gets out of the way, it's just pipes, it's a sacralized, mystical experience, and we need to avoid those things. Thanks so much for checking out the video. I really do appreciate it. Please leave your questions below, and I'll see you in the next video.